Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that will work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable coaching to learn more.
Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Stewart. Today I'm joined by Sam Yang. He's the president of field operations at People.ai, and we are going to talk about customer success versus sales. When each one should own the deal, when basically the rules of engagement and the swim lanes. Thing I love about having Sam on the show, we're going to get pretty nerdy on some of the CS stuff. We're going to talk about some NRR. We're going to get into our acronyms. Sam, I'm really excited to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Colin, I'm excited to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Thank you for having me on. I'm ready to jump right in.
Awesome. For people that are listening, if you're an AE or if you're a revenue leader, some of the things that we're going to get into might sound like we're taking a long walk to get to how it's valuable, but where I'm hoping to land is if you are, where this is going to be relevant to you is if you are negotiating any sort of renewal or upsell. We're going to talk about the way Sam thinks through each of these opportunities. So before we get into revealing all of Sam's dirty tricks, maybe not some dirty tricks, but secret hacks and things that you know your boss's boss won't tell you. Talk to me about the structure of a sales team that involves customer success and a sales component. What does that look like in the teams that you're running?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the structure of sales versus CS, what we do at People.ai, and you know, it's pretty common here. You typically have a sales team that's more offensive minded, and so it's football season, right? So let's use a football analogy. The sales team is essentially the offense. They try to put points up on the board. Then you've got the defense, which is the CS team, and they're trying to protect the base. And so these two teams typically come together. You usually have a leader of both. They come together. Sometimes it's under the CEO, sometimes under the president, sometimes CRO. It just really depends on the organization. But these two teams need to come together, work together to win together. And so that's the structure here. There's no hard and fast rule, but it's usually offense and defense.
Gotcha. Now, one of the biggest swim lane conflicts, or just CS and AEs swimming over each other, to beat this analogy to death, is who owns the renewal, if, what, when, and why. Do you have any guidance on, is it always one, is it always the other, or is it one of those, it depends?
Yeah, this is one of those things where it really depends. I'll actually I guess I'll stick with the football analogy. It's kind of like special teams when it comes to renewals. Depending on the situation you're in the game, the special teams, it's not offense or defense. It can actually be used offensively or defensively. And so similarly for a company, depending on where you are in your journey as a company, you may want to use renewals more offensively or defensively. So that's really high level, right? What I like to do is get right into some KPIs. And I think the best KPI to start off with is GRR. And this is really high level and directional, right? And then we'll get into more specifics here in a moment. But the way I like to see it is if your GRR as a company is over 95%, right? And that you have, exactly. Gross revenue retention is over 95%. That means you're doing a good job of retaining your customers and retaining your revenue. In that scenario, if you can have your CS team run a renewal and still have GRR of over 95%, then do it. That's great performance. You can free up salespeople to go focus on new business, on upsell, whatever it might be, but do it if you can. Now, if your GRR is somewhere between 90 to 95%, that's still decent GRR performance. I think that's really, it depends on who you are. But if your GRR performance is under 90%, what that's telling me is that your renewals are it's not just paperwork. It's not just light negotiation where you're negotiating, hey, is it a 3% or 5% increase? It tells me that there's actually a sales motion that needs to take place in order for you to prove value, in order for you to get your renewal done. So in that scenario, I would lean towards salespeople owning the renewal because I know that there's a certain amount of a sales activity that needs to take place in order to successfully renew. So these are, once again, just general guidelines from a very high level.
Gotcha. So if it's an easy, most people are going to renew. If it's Slack, I've got my CS team that's probably not even looking at my account because I'm pretty small. But in a case of something like that tool where, you keep using it, right? It's hard to rip and replace. You're probably not going to get an AE involved. If it's maybe Salesforce and there's all these things bundled together and you're trying to upsell and add on and the retention is a little bit less, then if it's a whole net new sale, then you got to remake the business case, then we're bringing the AE team in.
Yeah, I think it really is situational. When I say situational, I don't mean per deal. You have the AE or CSM drive the renewal, but I think just depending on where you are in your journey, that really will influence who should own the renewal as a best practice for your company.
Mm-hmm. Got it. I'm curious, how does product type influence the renewal?
Well, the way I like to think about it is this. When I think of product type, I don't think of it in terms of a finance product, right? Or like an HR application. Well, I actually think about it when it comes to renewals, whether you have a SaaS-based product, which is user-based licensing, or versus consumption-based. So starting off with user-based licensing, I would really say it really comes down to usage. Let's say you have a customer and there's 1,000 employees, you sold them 1,000 licenses, all right? And you consistently, not only for that customer, for all your customers, get 70, 80, 90% active usage adoption. So you have 700, 800, 900 folks just consistently using your product. That's pretty good. That's pretty darn good. The customer is probably going to renew. In that scenario, I would say, let's see if the CS team can drive the renewal. But let's say you're in a scenario where 10, 20, 30% of your licenses are actually being used. You're going to be in a situation come renewal that the customer is going to probably want to downsell or churn because they're not getting value or the full value from their product. In that scenario, the renewal is not just paperwork. The salesperson needs to come and resell the value of the product and what is possible with the product. So that I think of it in terms of that, a sense when it comes to user-based licensing. For consumption-based products where there's more metering, and it's very obvious because the revenue you have directly correlates to how much consumption is going on. And in that scenario, I really think it depends on where the expertise of your of renewals lies. If you have the expertise on the CS side, great, right? And if you don't, then the CS team should come in. So I think it really, and that's one of the things that I like to think about is what is the skill set of your CS team? A lot of companies have a support team that they call CS. And in that scenario, the skill set, the commercial experience probably doesn't exist there. So you wouldn't want renewals to be driven by that team. Yet on the other hand, you have scenarios where there is a renewal team within CS. So these folks are maybe not as aggressive as salespeople, but they do have commercial experience. They can negotiate. And if you have that skill set on your team, then why not? Why not have the CS team run renewals?
Maybe I'm just old, but that's called an account manager. And there's the thing that bothered me about CS is there was product, there was customer support, and then there was account managers. And people are like, Jason Lemkin's like, let's blend them together. And I'm like, but you're confusing the roles and they can be different. And I have no qualms at customer success. I remember being an account manager, and that is the account manager role. You are a salesperson and you are there to support the customer and make sure that they are using the product, service, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, Colin. So I got to tell you, I'm old school too. I'm 44. I'm 45 here in a couple of weeks. I'm used to that being called sales and account management, but I have seen over the past 5-10 years, that team is frequently found in the CS organization playing defense. I've seen it in both. That's why I'm not really religious about it. It doesn't really matter to me. It can sit in sales or CS. It's just, where does that skill set reside? And depending on where that skill set resides, you go with that team.
Totally. I didn't mean to nitpick on terminology, because in fairness, a modern customer success person is probably a little more solutions aware than your typical account manager, where you're a little bit more of a solutions engineer / somebody can go on and get your hands dirty in the tool than, say, a account manager of 10, 15 years ago.
Yes. I mean, things evolve, but yeah, I'm pretty loose on that. It depends on who you're talking to. Definitions can mean slightly different things. So like, I'm glad we clarified that.
Totally. I did want to go back to double click on the scenario. So let's say there's somebody listening, renewal is down. Their customer has been, hasn't had a great year, or for whatever reason, usage of the product is 20%. So you say you got a 100K deal and you got 20K of like actual active users. How do you handle that scenario? Is this the customer saying, hey, I'm going to churn, this is not useful? Are you trying to upsell and get them back up to 100K? Are you trying to say, you know what, if you can't afford it, go ahead? Are you trying to get them down to 20K and just kind of keep them on? I'd love to understand. And I know it's going to depend, but how would you think about, if I'm an AE bringing you this account, how do you think about what are the variables that would go into diagnosing, which direction or what strategy we're going to take?
Yeah, that's unfortunately, or I think that unfortunately, this is a very relevant question for a lot of folks right now, right? And I would approach it like this. First, you've heard the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So first of all, you don't want to find yourself in this situation. That's for starters. And I think there's so many things we can unpack from, did we sell them the right package to begin with, right? Or did we oversell them up front? And secondly, if you have a product that needs to be implemented, how did we do in terms of implementation, onboarding, customer training and all that? Did we do all of that well? And then it gets into this other part of just being whether your product is really mission critical or not, right? We all like to think our product is absolutely mission critical, but a lot of the products out there you can have a good product, but still be a nice to have, where you can operate your business without necessarily having it. It would be inconvenient. It might be a little painful, but your business can continue to run. So these are all things that I would definitely think about. And it's not just, I think it's a bigger question, but for the specific question that you're asking, it really does depend. And if you have a scenario where you have a strong champion and you have access to the economic buyer and they believe in your vision and you have a good relationship, then you don't necessarily have to take an 80K churn there, right? You got a 100K deal. Is it going to go down to 20K? You can use the relationship that you have to really try to reduce or minimize the amount of churn you have. There are other scenarios where maybe you don't have your champion anymore, or maybe the entire business unit is gone, or whatever it might be. In that scenario, I would not shoot for a flat renewal. You try to shoot that. That's very tone deaf. And in that scenario, I would try to shoot for the 20K and maybe implement some other things, give them trials of other products. But really, this is very situational. So there's no right answer here that's universally applicable. But I think it really depends on where you are and the types of relationships you have.
Totally fair. And so if we think about the three scenarios, just to summarize what I heard, it's, let them churn because it doesn't make sense anymore. Shoot for the 20, shoot for somewhere in the middle, and then shoot for a full renewal. And the variables that would go into it is, how good of a job do we do in selling it in the first place? How did implementation go? Is the product mission critical or not? How strong is the champion? What's your relationship with the economic buyer? And then I might add in one is like, whose fault is it? And I don't mean to like blame, but like, whose fault is it that they didn't use the tool? Did you sell me Slack and I just didn't invite any of my team? Because so that's on me, or was it a case of like, you sold me all these things and then my team tried using it and they didn't get the value, or it wasn't set up correctly? Is that a fair kind of, do you ever look at like fault, which is maybe the wrong word, but yeah.
No. Like, I think there's always shared accountability. And you have to look at, hey, did the CS team or the onboarding team, did they do a great job, right? Did the sales team, first of all, start from the beginning? Did they do a good job of selling the right package, setting the right expectations? Did the implementation onboarding team do a good job? Then did we do a good job of operationalizing the product, right? I mean, like once you learn it, if it's not part of your day to day, then it's going to sit on, it's going to become shelfware. So these are all things. And then I think you actually have to look at the product too. Is the product such that it's really challenging to get people to adopt and engage and use your product? So I think there's shared accountability here. There should be no finger pointing. You should just sit back and really look at this objectively to see, hey, where did this go wrong and how do we fix the root issue so this doesn't happen again?
Totally. And it sounds like the type of product market fit, whether you're nice to have or mission critical, really factors in quite strongly here.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think all of us, like I said, want to be mission critical. We like to say it, believe it, but outside of like CRM, email, web hosting, I mean, there's a handful of things that you just can't live without as a company. Like your business comes to screeching halt. Outside of that, then there are other products that are close to being mission critical. Maybe I'll throw, I don't know, like LinkedIn Sales Navigator. That's pretty important for salespeople, right? It's pretty important. Can you do your business without it? Yes. Do you want to do your business without it? Probably not. But it's close to being mission critical. And then there's everybody else. Like, oh, you could have a really good product, but hey, I can go a month or two or a quarter or two without your product and not die. If you're there, and then if the CS team actually exists to try to bridge that gap between being a good product, but a nice to have and mission critical, like that's the majority of their focus. Going back to the renewal question, I mean, I would not take bandwidth away from the CS team if that is what they're doing, because that is actually really important and that's helping to prevent churn.
Right. I am curious. You did say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. How, through the lens of either, call it revenue, what is how and when do you look at sort of product utilization on an account level? Like, is this something that you're reviewing with your team on a monthly basis, weekly, daily, annually, quarterly?
Oh, absolutely. This needs to be looked at on a weekly basis. So every CSM and AE, if you're an AE with existing customers, you've got to look at this on a monthly basis, and you got to work with your ops team to have a line graph, if you will, of all your customers and see how they're doing from a MAU, DAO, or WOW, weekly active user perspective. And if you're seeing a drop off, that's a bad signal. You want to see that going up and to the right. And if it's not, you're risking not only churn, you're not only risking churn, but you're also risking any upsell opportunity as well. So in a SaaS based, if you have a user-based license that you sold, engagement is everything. And that's where the CS and the AE team needs to come together, because without that, it's really hard to upsell. If going back to your example, if a customer is only using 20% of their licenses, good luck trying to sell them another product.
Okay. I do want to touch on upsells, because it does play into effect. Or it plays a huge role. Let's assume. And so I love the comment on looking at your product usage weekly. I know if the AEs are listening, this is probably not the most relevant piece, but there probably are some AEs that are listening that might be these kind of hybrid. Not everybody has a CS team anymore.
Yeah.
Not everybody has all these teams. Everybody's being asked to do more. And so if you are an AE that doesn't necessarily have this or have a CS team to support, and you are this individual, these are probably things that, if you're an AE and you're solo on this, a monthly check-in is probably good enough. What are your thoughts? CS advice for the solo AE, account manager.
I would say this: if you're an AE that only has new business, right? New just prospects. You're not a hybrid. I think if you have some sort of PLG motion where there's like a free service, the same principle would apply there. So you want to try to drive as much consistent usage of your free product and increase the number of active users, because that's gonna you're essentially warming up the account, right? So that's what I would say. Uh, if you don't have that, I would say it actually applies even to your content. Like, let's say you have monthly webinars. You want more of your prospects to be joining the webinar. So I think the same concept applies, even though it may not be identical. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I follow you. And the time and the amount of, if you're an AE, I point to myself as AE. I still think of myself as an AE sometimes. But if you're a full cycle salesperson, you can't do what a full cycle AE, SDR, and CS team are going to be able to do. You have to scale it back. I am curious, at what point in the process are you looking at upsell opportunities? So is there a certain, like, okay, once they hit 80% utilization or 90%, we're going to start adding these other things. So we're only going to go and upsell stable revenue? Or I guess a better question is, how do you think about the timing of when and where to bring in upsell conversation to a customer?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I personally look when I'm thinking about growth, right? I think of a couple of things. So let's start off with, you said you see yourself as an AE, right? Sometimes you still see yourself like that. I think you have to really look at time allocation. If you are doing renewals, let's say, because that's always like a potentially a tricky topic, right? Are you taking away bandwidth from upselling because you're working on a renewal and you're trying to sometimes do churn prevention? Are you taking away bandwidth from bringing on new prospects? What's the ideal time allocation for you to maximize growth? That's one data point I would be thinking about, or one variable. The other question is, how much white space do you truly have? And a lot of times as executives, you say, oh, we have X number of customers, and so our TAM is Y. Is that truly your white space? Is that just theoretical TAM, or what's your SAM? What is actually sellable over the next 12 to 24 months? I would look at where your white space is, because let me tell you just a quick story. So I worked at this one place, and when I first came, so we had AEs doing new business and AMs doing existing business. And when I first joined, the AMs were crushing it. 200K was considered like a pretty big deal. And this is years back. And they were upselling deals to 400, 500K. And they were crushing it. The AEs were looking on the AMs enviously. They're like, oh my goodness, if I just had the existing business, I would crush it. Then after about 2 years, the tide changed where the AMs sold into they sold into the white space. And now they were fighting to protect the base. They had 400, 500K deals now, and they didn't want that churn, and they weren't easily turning to 700, 800K deals. The new business, however, started really taking off. We went from early adopter phase to mainstream customers. So we were getting the Walmarts, the Targets, the NFL, and like great logos. And we were bringing in 300-400K new business deals, which is fantastic. So now the AMs were looking enviously upon new business, saying, oh, they get all the big deals. The point of the story is, where is your growth? Is your growth in upsell, or is it in new business? And based upon that, I'll say that's another big factor into thinking about how you align your organization. Now, there's one other thing. I'm going to geek out just a little bit here.
Get into it.
All right. So there's this thing called LTV. I'm sure, Colin, you know about it, like lifetime value, right? I think this is a really cool metric. I think it's underutilized right now by sales executives, CS executives. So the way most B2B companies B2B SaaS companies calculate LTV is life expectancy times ASP times gross margin percentage. Like, these are the three things generally. I mean, some people do it differently, but generally speaking, that's how you do it. So life expectancy is essentially 1 divided by the churn rate. So if your churn rate is 10%, it's 1 divided by 10%. So your life expectancy is 10. So if you were to improve your churn from 10% to 5%, so you cut your churn in half, it'd be 1 divided by 5%, and your life expectancy would go to 20 years, right? 1 divided by 5%. So what that would essentially do is it would double your LTV, right? Mm-hmm. So because you're doubling your LTV because you're cutting your churn in half. Now, the one thing I don't know if people realize this is that churn and ASP are almost identical, are directly correlated. So if you have a 10% increase in ASP, but you also have a 10% increase in churn, it basically nullifies all gains and your LTV is exactly the same. So that's essentially how it works. So going to growth, and like if you're trying to prioritize growth, where should you put renewals? Let's say you gave renewals to sales. Sales folks are generally more aggressive. And let's say they can increase ASPs by 10%. You have 100K ASP, they bring it up to 110K. Okay, that's fair. But generally, when you're more aggressive, you are going to drop a few more balls, right? And so let's say your churn then goes up 10%, and your churn, let's say it was 10%, it goes not up to 20, that's a 100% increase, but if your churn goes from 10% to 11% in that scenario, right? You're from an LTV perspective, you have gained nothing. So you need to make sure when you're thinking about growth and all your strategies that if you're going to increase ASPs with different strategies, you need to balance it with what is this going to do to your churn, because that'll impact your life expectancy and that's going to dictate what your LTV is. I know I geeked out there for a little bit, but does that make sense?
Yeah. Let me pare it back. The core idea that came back to me, and I spent enough time in stats and economics in college that the idea of the demand curve comes to mind, which is, the idea that volume and price have there's a correlation, and you can plot it out on a curve effectively. The higher the price is, the lower the demand is going to be, and it's sort of the same idea in this instance.
100%. So if you're trying to grow, you don't want to just think about this quarter. You want to think about, hey, the next 4 quarters, 6, 8 quarters. If you do that, you want to think in terms of LTV as well. Totally. In that scenario, what I'm saying is that any strategy that you implement that allows you to grow, increase your ASP, that's fantastic, right? But you have to make sure that you're not sacrificing the net gains by potentially increasing churn as well. They're directly correlated from a percentage perspective.
100% agree. I'm not going to name the vendor, but there's a vendor that we all know that I was a longtime customer of, that every year price went up 7 to 15% because F you, that's why. No additional value. When we would push back, oh no, CEO says it has to, or we're going to turn you all off. And they were somewhat mission critical, but not as mission critical as they thought, because we're no longer a customer. And they got us up from, an amount to, but I think they almost doubled over 5 or 6 years. They almost doubled the size of our account, which sucked for us and is the reason why we eventually left. I'm curious, and they claim to be adding all these valuable things, and they went from a single thing to a multiple thing. We didn't like any of the other multiple things, but they were still charging us for. I'm curious your thoughts on somebody, if an account exec, a CS rep is listening, or a sales leader is listening, what are some guidance that you would give to them on how to think about when to give away something for free to increase that lifetime value versus to sell something to grow the ASP?
Look, I understand the pressure that everybody's under, right? We came from, the past 7, 8 years. I'm not talking about the past year, but before that, the past 7, 8 years, we had a historical run. The startup community has never grown faster, right? There was plenty of funding. Man, things that have changed. And I think let's forget about what's going on right now. Just the principle that you should live on is that, and you should live by, is that you really need to take care of your customers first. Before you raise prices, if you're going to raise your price 10%, you better make sure that the customer feels like they're getting 20% more value. That's the model. You want your customers to love you. The scenario that you're talking about is very common, and there's a lot of pressure, but I would advise not to do it unless you're absolutely sure that the customer is getting twice the value. If they're not getting twice, or in your case, 7% or whatever, make sure they're getting 15 or 20% more value. Then you would think it's worth it. It's like, okay, it's fair. I'm getting a ton. But too often, companies are just trying to grow, and they're implementing these policies, and it's backfiring. And so look, in your case, I'm sure you would have been a loyal customer if the price increases weren't so significant, and this is a scenario where everyone loses, and that's what you want to avoid.
100%. This is even before inflation got really crazy the last couple of years. Like we turned a couple of years ago, and yeah, I wouldn't want to know what my price would be now had we stuck around, but it was untenable.
Yeah. So the one thing, just really quickly, we at our company, we use this concept of deposits and withdrawals, right?
Mm-hmm. Love it.
Asking for a price increase is a withdrawal. It's like you're going to the ATM, don't ever withdraw unless you've done plenty of deposits, right? If you've given the customer a lot of value, then it's like, okay, it's fair, it's reasonable, and they might be totally fine with it. So that's how we like to think about it over here.
100%. I'm with you. And I think our perspective was the product, whatever it is, has been about the same or has even gotten worse. And we're paying 50% more than we were 3 years ago. Anyway, I don't want to rag on this one vendor. I do want to ask about how you think about renewal opportunities. If let's say everything's hunky-dory, we're not talking about the 20% renewal scenario. How do you think about getting BDR, SDR, AE, or BDR, SDR support in an opportunity?
Yeah, I think this should be more of an anomaly than a best practice or a common occurrence. I think when you are in a situation where we have this thing called red accounts, and everywhere I've been, red accounts, like which ones are in trouble? Well, there's this, the next step, or I want to say the next step, the next tiering that's even worse than a red account is what I'd call a dead account. So maybe the team that you are working with or the business unit is no longer there, especially in this economy, or your champion and all of his or her directs and your coach and the economic part, everyone's gone. What do? Well, you actually have to treat that like a new business prospect, except you might have a 2, 3, 4 month ticking time bomb before churn hits. In that scenario, who is best equipped to scalably reaching out to an organization and trying to get a beachhead, trying to get a conversation? And that's the SDR, BDR team. So there are scenarios with not red, but I would say dead accounts where it might make sense to get BDR, SDR support. But if this is starting to become a common occurrence where you have so many dead accounts, there are a lot of other questions that you need to answer, which is the CS, is the onboarding training, CS practice, discipline, like, do we have serious gaps there? Or you got to look at the product too and say, is it just too hard for our customers to really adopt our product? So I think it raises some other questions.
Is my resume up to date? A bit of a dark joke, but I say this having been there in that scenario. And I've told the story on the podcast a million times, but I sold into construction in 2008 and watched a very large commission check. The likelihood of me getting that commission check gradually disappear, and I ended up leaving the company before I would have gotten it, and the company was bankrupt a couple months later. So,
and I know we've all been through something. If you've been through 2001 and 2002. 2001 to 3, 2008 to 10. I mean, those were some couple of hard spots. And then again, in 2022. So yeah, all of us who through that have some stories to share for sure.
I was just getting into it in 2003. And so I didn't have a quota yet. Fortunately, I was selling like cell phone contracts. I had a quota, but it was like one a week. It was nothing. I was not a real bag to carry. But I want to get back to you because I want to talk about we all have these vendor negotiations, and the CS team, the AE team always wants to lock up term. And I, as the owner, as the decision maker, I want to be flexible. Something better is going to come out, something cheaper is going to come out. So I'm going to put pressure on. I only want to sign a 1-year term. What is year 2, 3, 5? How do you think about securing term, and how much are you willing to sacrifice? How much ASP are you willing to sacrifice in order to lock me up for a long period of time?
Yeah, I think so. There's this guy named Alejandro I used to work with. I won't say his last name. I'll keep it anonymous. He moved back to Europe. I love this guy. He's one of the smartest data guys. And I still remember I was sitting with him in San Francisco overlooking Market Street. And I was telling him what I wanted to see, right? I was like, what? Like, like in terms of data. And so he built this thing, an ARR cohort analysis. And this is one of the most important things that I think everyone should use. I don't know if everyone does it. So I'll try to explain it, and I'll bring it back to ASPs and renewals. So what he did was he built a cohort analysis for every year. And then we could slice and dice it by vertical and do all sorts of cool stuff. So he would put like, let's say 2015, 16, 17, 18, and the total amount of ARR we brought in, he would have a starting point. And then on that x-axis, he would have the quarters go by. And he would it's pretty simple. It was a line graph. And for certain cohorts of years, we would see that the amount of ARR would go up after 2-3 quarters, and it would keep going up. But there were other cohorts or years where the ARR after 4 quarters would actually go down, which means that we have a little more churn than upsell, right? And then it wouldn't be till 6 quarters in where we would hit an inflection point, and then that cohort would start growing again. There were some cohorts where it took 7-8 quarters before we started growing past the original ARR amount that we closed that year. The reason why I bring this up is, first of all, I think every sales and CS exec needs this. You need to visually see what's going on with each cohort, and you need to slice and dice by vertical, by market, by all of that, right? Like Europe, LATAM, APAC, Americas, all of that. Now, based upon this, that should inform your multi-year strategy. Because if you're seeing that each cohort is stabilizing at month 4 or 4 quarters out or 6 quarters out, you absolutely want to close a 2-year deal. And you should be sacrificing a percentage of your ASP in order to secure that 2-year deal. It's worth it to you so that you don't have more churn than upsell for that cohort of customers. So that's one of the first things I would do, is get this visualization, do the cohort analysis. And by doing that, you can make a data-driven decision as to how important 2- and 3-year deals are versus a 1-year deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm curious in that scenario, how much work is the contract doing for renewals versus the product? Because it seems like maybe in an example where your retention goes down at the 12-month mark, but you're contracted in for the next 3 years, your contract's doing a whole lot of work, which is going to put pressure on the relationship. Versus if it's going to be a growth year, if you generally see your accounts growing, then it probably it makes less sense to do a long-term revenue deal because it's going to grow anyway.
100% agree. Yeah, we're seeing eye to eye here. That's what you want to do. I mean, if you have a product that's growing pretty quickly, right, and the cohort analysis shows after 12 months, you've gone from 100% of whatever you brought into 115% or 120. That's fantastic. You don't need multi-year deals, right? Especially if it's growing. But we're not all there, right? So we have scenarios where 20-30% of your licenses are being used. So what do you think is going to happen at the end of a 12-month contract? The likelihood is that it's that cohort and that ARR is going to get smaller. So I would say that's really, really important to understand. And based upon that, I would be willing to sacrifice ASP, 10% increase to prevent 15-20 points of churn. Of course, I would do that any day. And so this is a data-driven way of making that determination of how aggressively you should pursue your multi-year strategy.
Love it. And so the short version of the story is, if every client is up and to the right, then we're probably not offering any discounts for multi-year. But if you see churn or if you see product utilization taking a little while to hit that curve, then discounting for multi-year to give your people the best chance of getting through that down and up curve. With
perfectly stated. Yeah. Yes. I mean, there could be unique situations where that may not be the case. Like maybe renewals at a small subset of the SaaS providers are really challenged. Okay, then that might not make sense. But a general rule of thumb, you summarize it perfectly.
And I love the idea that you're looking at this not just customers as a whole, but certain segments. Some types of users are going to be power users. Some are going to be less likely to be power users. And so it's not just one hard and fast rule. It's look at the data, figure out where your best users are and where your most at-risk users are, and then offer, I guess, build the strategy accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And I would say even by market. So I've been in I've worked at places in the past where, more than 50% of the revenue came internationally. And so there are certain markets where you just don't do multi-year deals because the risk of debt bad debt in years 2 and 3 is just too high, right? There's certain countries where they're more cash-based societies. You pay cash and you get 1 or 2 years depending on how much cash you pay. Out in the West, Western Europe, the US, we honor our contracts more or less. So yeah. So by and large, that's not as big of a concern. But you would want to do it by vertical, by market, and by segment too. Because generally speaking, you have more just bad debt and just like turnover in the SMB and mid-market space. So if that is part of your customer base, you want to think twice before giving someone a discount, giving them a better deal, a lower ASP for a multi-year deal when you have a lot of bankruptcy or companies that aren't going to be around in the future.
I do want to get to the upside and talk about net revenue retention in a minute. But before we do, if we could detour to the dark side, what happens when company is turns into a bad debt for whatever reason? How do you think about what does your company do? And it doesn't have to be People.ai specifically, but how do you think about a scenario where a company is unable to pay or just not gonna live up to the multi-year contract that it signed?
Yeah, I mean, this is the tough side, and we're seeing a lot more of this because of the economy. But even before the economy, I think I've been in I would bucket these situations into two buckets. I put them into two categories. One is the customer is truly having a hard time and they have to make decisions on what they're going to pay for. And they're only going to pay for mission critical solutions. They need to keep the lights on. They need their website up. Okay. That's unfortunate, right? So you generally let it go or you send it to collections and try to do the most of it. Okay. Then there's other scenarios where there are companies who can pay, but they're just not paying because they don't want to or whatever. They're not honoring their contract. In that scenario, I mean, we have tried everything and sometimes we've been successful. We've tried to renegotiate. Sometimes that's been successful, but and sometimes it's a negotiation tactic on their end. They just want to lower their bill for years 2 and 3, right? That maybe they're not fully using all their licenses and they're on the hook for years 2 and 3. They're not paying and it's a negotiation tactic. But I've even had customers where they're not going to pay. It's just shady. They know they should, but they don't. And so in those scenarios, you unfortunately can't do anything but send them over to collections and just, you hope for the best. I mean, you don't want to wish harm on anybody, but it really sucks when that's the situation. And but I would say that's really the minority of the time, right? Most people that you deal with, they try to do the right thing.
How do you think about net revenue retention in the sort of theoretical revenue ceiling?
Yeah, so I want to start off by saying, I just trying to frame NRR or net revenue retention. So the gold standard is 95% GRR, right? And then NRR is just upsell on top of GRR. That's all NRR is. And so if you're at 95% GRR and if you're at 120% or higher plus for NRR, you're putting your company in a very good position to have a successful exit. So that's just like the frame, right? That's like not a Colin and Sam thing. This is just what the industry is looking at, what Wall Street's looking at, and investors as well. So in order to increase or have an NRR strategy, there's a couple of things that I recommend. One is simple, takes a lot of discipline, which is how you do revenue recognition. So let's say you have a 3-year deal and year 1 is 100K, year 2 is 150K, and you add some more licenses, year 3 is 200K. I'm just making it super simple. A lot of companies will average the ARR and it'll be 150K of ARR. And they'll recognize 150K of ARR, but it'll be flat for all 3 years. And it doesn't really tee you up for growth and it doesn't really help your NRR. It gives you that extra 50K pot, but doesn't help NRR. Now, this takes discipline, but one thing you can do is recognize 100K of ARR and then recognize another 50K of ARR each additional year. So now you have that upsell in the bank, if you will. And so that's one strategy. But like I said, I keep saying it takes a lot of discipline up front not to take that 50K right now. Mm-hmm. Another strategy I would highlight is this is during negotiation. As sales folks tend to try to maximize the budget that the revenue you're going to get, and then shove as much as possible. Like just give them whatever they want. Let's maximize the budget and let's move on. It's a very common mindset, but that's not always best when it comes to having a strategic NRR strategy. What I would recommend is if you take the case of a company with 1,000 employees, instead of giving them 1,500 licenses because they tell you they're going to grow by 50% over the next year, and then just maximizing their budget, the reason why you wouldn't want to do that is because that company may not grow to 1,500. In fact, they may have layoffs and you're going to be in a really bad situation, right? Where it's not just NRR, but GRR that's hurt. Instead, sell them fewer licenses than 1,000. That's something to consider. And give them flexible deployment options in case they get over. So let's say you're at 750 and give them the ability to over provision by 100% of their licenses. So they can provision up to 1,500. Now come renewal time, let's say they're still at 1,000, you still have some upsell opportunity there, which will help NRR. So that's another strategy. The other strategy is more on the CS side. At People.ai, we've done a really good job. When I came back, it took a certain period of time to implement our product, and we really focused on time to value, time to first value and time to value, and we whittled that down by 40% already, and we're trying to whittle that down even more, right? So time to first value, we got like within a couple of weeks, and so what we're trying to do is cut the whole thing in half. Like, how can we get time to value, do implementations in half the time that we used to? That's a really good way to start increasing more users. So that's something that CS can do on their end. And then also another thing they can do is just like the weekly check-in of being fanatical about driving more adoption with your product. Even though your product is not naturally viral and it may take manual work, that's what CS needs to do. And if you do that, that will help GRR, which will give you more opportunities to upsell and increase your NRR, your NRR performance. So anyway, those are some strategies that I would recommend that both CS and salespeople can think about.
I feel like I blinked and this hour just flew by. I honestly, it feels like we've only been recording for a few minutes here. I really appreciate you coming on. I did want to double click on one last thing. You talked about time to first value, time to the main value. I want to end with, talk to me about what is the first value that users of People.ai are going to get, and then how quickly do they get that, and then when do they get the main value? Like what's that first quick win? What's the next like big surge that people see with People.ai?
Yeah, so when a customer comes on, I mean, what we do at our company is we do a lot of things, right? We're a data company at our core, and by the time you are able to get data from email, CRM, and calendar and make sense of it, and then have that visualized, it can take a little bit of time, right? Because a lot of times you have to get approvals from like security teams. Like, do you have access? Like, you need permission to have access email and all of those things. So what we did was, hey, instead of doing that, instead of going with the Big Bang Theory, why don't we set up parts of our product where customers can get value right away? They can start seeing insights right away and better understand what is going on in their environment. Are there different parts of our product that don't necessarily need sign off from all like compliance teams and all that? So we really rethought how we implemented, and our customers have been a lot happier because literally within a few weeks, they're starting to get value as opposed to, having to wait a longer period of time.
And so specifically, help me understand, like I sign up today, 2 weeks from now, what am I getting from People.ai? What is that first magical moment?
oh, we have a strong services team that will do the implementation, but they'll look at your data and then they'll start giving you like, hey, how many contacts can we update into CRM? Like that's a big, salespeople are really lazy. They don't want to put contacts into this Salesforce. We automate all of that. So basically, one of the things we do is we take the heavy lifting away from sales reps of having to update CRM. We do that all for you. And so now you have really good visibility into what everybody's doing. So now you're getting visibility into what's going on in your organization before having to configure everything. So that's just one of many things that our services team is doing to give you the value right away.
I love it. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show. If somebody's interested in People.ai, they want to learn more, or they want to learn more about the sales and customer success org and maybe want to work for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
My email is just sam.yang@People.ai. Also, on top of that, you can hit me up on LinkedIn and I'll get back to you.
Perfect. I will throw a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes here. And so if anybody's trying to hit them up, the link is wherever you get your podcast. It's in the little note section. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, really enjoyed felt like a 4-minute conversation on AEs and customer success reps.
Yeah, Colin, I had a fantastic time. It's a great privilege to be on this podcast with you. Hope your listeners enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, and thanks to everybody for listening. We'll see you all next week.